Hey, Jaxon here, celebrating the 3.5-month anniversary on the channel. I wasn't gonna wait to celebrate the 4-month anniversary, so...
Overall, the channel is doing very well so far. It has almost 70 subscribers and each video on average gets at least 100 views. Don't get me wrong, it's still very small, but if it keeps growing at this rate, I know for a fact this channel will start going places.
And in order to celebrate, I got myself a present. Let's check it out. Thanks, me.
SpongeBob's Truth or Square is a 2009 video game that was released for the Xbox 360, Wii, PSP, and DS. The game is based on the SpongeBob episode Truth or Square, which was an hour-long special made to celebrate the series' 10th anniversary. It's generally not held in high regard by SpongeBob fans. I myself decided to rewatch the special in preparation for this video, and it's not very good. In fact, I'd say it's pretty bad. The episode has some cool things in it, like a brand new stop-motion intro, a cover of the SpongeBob theme song by CeeLo Green, a lot of celebrity cameos, and even my boy Patchy the Pirate, but in terms of the actual episode, it's just SpongeBob and friends dicking around some air vents for about an hour with some unfunny Family Guy cutaway gags sprinkled throughout. So that wouldn't give you any particularly high hopes for the video game tie-in, but if you check the back of the box, there's a familiar name on it that should: Heavy Iron Studios. They're pretty well known as the developers behind SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom, a 3D platformer that was released for all major consoles in 2003. While it received mixed reviews at the time of its release, the game has since developed a large following and is now considered a cult classic, to the point where it got a remake in 2020. The studio also developed a second SpongeBob game, this time based on the first SpongeBob movie that came out a year later in 2004. It doesn't have as large of a following as their previous game, and most people consider it inferior, but it's still well known and held in high regard by many people. This game, on the other hand, now, people don't think that Truth or Square is awful. They just don't think it exists. Almost nobody mentions it when talking about Heavy Iron SpongeBob titles, most likely because the people that grew up on their first two outings had long since outgrown the series by the time this game came out. I mean, there was a 5-year gap between the SpongeBob movie game and Truth or Square. However, is that really the reason why? Or does nobody talk about this game because it's just not good?
Well, that's what we're gonna find out today. So, let's play SpongeBob's Truth or Square to see if it's a hidden gem, or if it deserves to be forgotten.
My global domination begin!
So, I bet you're wondering, how do we take the plot of the TV special and adapt it into a video game? It's quite simple.
We don't!
The plot of the game is completely different, which, hey, not complaining about that, I don't see how they can make a video game out of that special. The game's plot has only one thing in common with that of the specials, which is that it's the Krusty Krab's 11th anniversary, and there's a big party being thrown in celebration. Here though, the party is held at SpongeBob's house, and as a result, Mr. Krabs entrusts SpongeBob with the Krabby Patty secret formula. Since SpongeBob is SpongeBob, he immediately loses it and can't remember where he put it. He's just like me for real, for real. Plankton finds out about this, and as you'd expect, offers to help SpongeBob find the formula, where he'll ultimately backstab him and get it for himself when he finds out its location. He hooks up SpongeBob to a machine in the chum bucket, puts him to sleep, and enters SpongeBob's mind along with his nanobots. We start the game in SpongeBob's house, which acts as our main hub world. We can slowly upgrade the house more and more by collecting happiness tokens and objects. Happiness tokens are these coins with SpongeBob's face on them that we collect in levels by defeating enemies and destroying objects, or in the hub world by interacting with NPCs, while happiness objects are usually found at the end of a stage. There's also additional challenges and a shop where you could purchase costumes and upgrades for SpongeBob and other characters. As for the main game, it has SpongeBob and his friends think of all the good times they've had together in order to get SpongeBob as happy as possible, since then he'll be able to remember the location of the formula. The game consists of 7 levels and 3 boss fights, which, excluding the final boss, are all based on previous SpongeBob episodes. The episodes in question are Jellyfishing, Tea at the Tree Dome, No Weenies Allowed, Help Wanted, Christmas Who, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, Just One Bite, Graveyard Shift, and Karate Island. I find this to be really cool. The TV special also had flashbacks, but they were all random cutaway gags rather than actual flashbacks to previous SpongeBob episodes. Now, since these levels don't exactly lend themselves greatly to video game levels, the devs had to take some massive creative liberties. One example is the level based on Help Wanted. Instead of taking place at the Krusty Krab, this level takes place at a random Bikini Bottom beach, and consists of SpongeBob activating these patty-making machines in order to feed multiple groups of starving anchovies. Enough explaining the levels though, what do they actually like to play? Compared to Battle for Bikini Bottom and the SpongeBob movie game, which were mainly focused on platforming, Truth or Square has a far larger focus on combat, making it a hybrid between a beat-em-up and a 3D platformer. There will be multiple points within levels where the player will have to beat up a certain amount of enemies to progress, and that can be seen as annoying filler to some, but for me, I wasn't too bothered by them. They were enjoyable and didn't overstay their welcome. SpongeBob has 3 attacks that he can use to defeat enemies, all of which involve him contorting his body into different shapes. He can transform into a spatula and smash anything in front of him, a wheel that acts as a spin attack and glide, and a cannon that shoots out water balloons. The cannon is only really necessary to hit buttons in required sections and stops you dead in your tracks, making you open to enemy attacks and as a result, completely useless in combat. The spatula is a very useful move, but it also stops you dead in your tracks, and your inputs are locked until the attack's animation is over, making you an easy target for enemies, and while a minor inconvenience at first, it becomes more and more annoying as the game goes on. I found myself using the spin most often, since it lacked the issues those two had. There's also a handful of power-ups that SpongeBob can use to his advantage. There's your standard invincibility power-up, but there's also these power-ups that summon SpongeBob's friends to help out, which are kinda useful when you're tired of beating up enemies and just want the game to play itself for 15 seconds. The most useful power-up is this one that makes SpongeBob buff and gives his attacks more power, with the trade-off being that you lose it after getting hit. Basically, think of the super mushroom from the Mario series, but instead of making Mario taller, it makes him jacked. As for the platforming, it's simpler compared to the previous games. There were a handful of sections that challenged me, and it does get slightly more difficult as it goes on, but for the most part, this game is a walk in the park. Although it'll probably be somewhat challenging to this game's target demographic, which is really young kids that like SpongeBob.
I'm strangely attracted to that repulsive dinosaur!
Moving away from the gameplay, let's talk about the game's superficial elements, the graphics, and soundtrack. Because if you played Truth or Square, you'll know that it's kinda lacking in both areas. The graphics aren't terrible. I consider them to be an improvement over Battle for Bikini Bottom in the movie game. In fact, I really like video game graphics from that era and consider them to be really charming. But those games were released on the PS2 and GameCube, and this was released on the 360. It's not like this was released early on into the 7th generation either. Like I said, this came out in 2009, and developers had a pretty good understanding of these systems' hardware at this point. To be fair, this was a licensed kids game that probably had a budget of my left shoe and some spare change. And this also came out on Wii, so that also could have been a reason towards the graphics looking like an upscaled PS2 game. The graphics aren't bad, I want to repeat that. I like the way this game looks, but it's just not up to the standards of video game graphics at the time in which it was released. The soundtrack is also equally disappointing, not because it's bad, but because there's no new music in this game. All of the tracks are either taken from Heavy Iron's previous SpongeBob games, or the show itself. It's not like Sonic Generations, where pretty much the entire soundtrack is just old music that has been either remixed or rearranged. They just dragged and dropped the audio files with no changes at all. I 100% know that this wasn't Heavy Iron's fault, and that they probably just didn't have the budget to make new music, but it still doesn't stop it from feeling cheap and lazy.
On a more positive note,
Since I guess we have nothing else to talk about, we should move on to the game's ending. SpongeBob finally remembers the location of the secret formula, which is the Krusty Krab's safe. He breaks out of Plankton's machine, ready to go get it, but Plankton was one step ahead, and has transformed the Chum Bucket into a mech in order to get the formula and destroy the Krusty Krab. But I guess since the writers thought the game needed to have bigger stakes, he accidentally pushes a button on the mech that makes it instructed to instead destroy the entire city. The final boss has SpongeBob jumping across Bikini Bottom rooftops while avoiding hazards, whether they be falling buildings, missiles, or waves of enemies before entering the mech itself, where he then has to destroy a few generators to destroy this barrier guarding the heart of the mech. Then you're supposed to wail on the thing before the mech spits you out. Repeat the process a couple more times and you're golden. It's not a particularly challenging final boss, but it feels very climatic and is a great way to end the game. It's way more interesting than the previous boss fights, which were just avoiding the same few attacks before hitting the enemy in their very obvious weak spot. With Plankton defeated, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs go to the Krusty Krab safe to get the formula, only for it to turn out that the formula isn't in the safe and that it was actually in SpongeBob's back pocket the entire time. But then they find out that it was actually Mr. Krabs' lottery ticket and that the actual formula was in Mr. Krabs' back pocket the entire time, meaning he accidentally gave SpongeBob the lottery ticket and that SpongeBob never had the formula to begin with.
Did I lose you there?
Plankton has his typical villain speech where he whines that he got so close to the formula this time, and Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob just smile at each other. And that's SpongeBob's Truth or Square. It's solid, although it's not nearly as good as Heavy Iron's previous SpongeBob games. The game is exactly what you'd picture when the phrase licensed kids game is brought up. A good licensed kids game, but a licensed kids game nonetheless. Compare that to the studio's previous SpongeBob games, which, while flawed and most likely directed towards younger audiences, it felt like those games could be enjoyed by anyone of any age. The game feels far cheaper with its outdated visuals and unoriginal soundtrack, all things I'm sure were caused by a very low budget and not any laziness on the devs' part. In fact, I think the entire reason this game ended up the way it was just because of budget constraints. But overall, I liked it. I found it to be a really nice comfort game, something that isn't very challenging, maybe not the most tightly designed game on the planet, but still a fun time and relaxing. And I can confirm that it is a million times better than the TV special which it was based on.
Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you have a good one, and happy 3.5 month anniversary to the channel. I want to thank everybody who showed up. I should probably start putting everything away.